A note of warning. This podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Daily, the podcast, bringing you high-profile and under-the-radar cases from across the country every week. Today is October 10th, 2019. I'm Owen Michael. Billy Jensen is out of town today. Our guest this week is author Jan Burke, a mystery/crime writer and a best-selling author. He's written 15 books, and you have a special advocation for advancing forensic science, as I understand it.
Yes.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So Jan, like I said, you write a lot of crime fiction. You've got short stories. You've got some novels out, and talk about your interest in forensic science and what kind of brought you to that specialization.
Right. Well, early on, by the time I reached starting my second book, I realized that I was going to need to learn a lot more about evidence and how evidence worked. And I found that forensic scientists were really very generous in terms of sitting down. And most writers in my genre find that. And they're great at explaining complex science to dummies or to people who don't understand science, because they have to do it before juries all the time. So as I got to know these people and started going to classes and conferences and getting deeper into it because I enjoy science, I realized about the time that CSI was becoming a big hit that there was
what would we say, like basically early 2000s?
Early 2000s,
Yeah.
right. So in about 2003, I was invited to be a speaker at the American Society of Crime Lab Directors conference. And the trade-off was they couldn't pay me, but they'd let me go to all the sessions. So I was like, I'm in, you know.
Wow.
So they flew me out there and gave me room and board and all that. But my fee was just being able to eavesdrop. And I realized that there was just this gigantic gap. I'd already been realizing there was a gigantic gap between what people were seeing on television as what a crime lab looked like and was able to do versus the reality. Now, that's not saying the science wasn't real in CSI. It was just that nobody was funding their local lab to do that kind of work. I knew that at that point, in 2003, DNA was not being used to solve rapes and murders. It was being used as a prosecution tool because the lab was so backed up that they couldn't use it as an investigative tool.
Right.
So I thought, now, lab directors are not in a position to say much about that. So, chief of police.
They don't want to get in the mix of the politics of it.
Right. Chief of police does not want you going out there saying, we're backlogged, you know.
Right.
So, on the other hand, he also sees all of you as a bunch of Poindexters usually, you know, and there's not he didn't come up through the lab usually.
The shoe leather police work of actually walking the beat and knocking on doors and things like that. Sure.
So if he gets money, he wants to go with what he's familiar with this problem. So, anyway, there got to be a catch-22 with all of that. The lab's not doing much for us. We're not doing much for the lab, and it went around and around. And so I called up a bunch of writer friends from that conference and said, we can talk to the public. We can get this out there. How about if we form a loose organization? I promise no meetings, no dues. All you have to do is talk about this in front of people. I'll send you links. I'll send you educational materials from the NIJ or whatever, National Institute of Justice. And people pitched right in.
The National Institute of Justice is part of it's an agency within the Department of Justice?
It is. And it's sort of the research arm of the Department of Justice. They're the ones that do studies on violence and policing methods and things like that to see what's effective.
Yeah,
right.
I gotcha.
So.
Well, you're in the right place because obviously we deal with a lot these days, especially, the news is out there that a lot of backlogs have now been sort of caught up, at least the processing, now plugging in the actual things, and we can sort of talk about that. We're going to do a little web extra at the end of this particular podcast, and we'll have that up for you next week, and we'll kind of go a little bit more in depth into more about the forensics and what your takeaway is these days and what we're working on with that. But first, why don't we kind of cover some of the stories that we've got? Like I said, we try to bring the freshest stuff every week, and we've got some stories today. This Samuel Little story, which a lot of true crime people out there may be familiar with.
Right.
That's obviously got some forensic stuff here, but that's this one's all kind of a combination of some of the stuff is high tech science, but it's also old school. This is a Texas Ranger who basically flew out to L.A. and got this guy through rapport, basically got this guy to chat. So the background on this, basically, Samuel Little is 79 years old. The FBI just released a collection of updated info this week related to Samuel Little. This guy is now considered the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. They think he's confessed to 93 murders, and the FBI is following up on a lot of these things. They're considered credible. Obviously, we have criminals out there who want to sort of make up numbers and for clout and for everything else, but they apparently think that this guy back basically from the 70s up until 2005 was traveling across the country. He was kind of drifting, working odd jobs. They think 93 is plausible. They've verified at least 50 of Samuel Little's murders so far. Up to this point, it was Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who'd been convicted of 49 murders, so already he's just one above. John Wayne Gacy was convicted of 33 murders. Ted Bundy only convicted of 3, suspected or he confessed to 30. Of course, John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy both executed. So the FBI released a bunch of information this week covering some of the unsolved stuff. Basically, in 2012, he was sitting in stir in Kentucky, and they found out that he had a warrant in California. They shipped him back here to face a drug charge. The LAPD took his DNA, and that linked him to 3 unsolved homicides and murders in the late 1980s. So then he got convicted in 2014 to 3 life sentences, never getting out.
I think it's good at this point to say, because although a Texas Ranger did a lot, and I'm sure you're getting to that part of it, kudos to the LAPD, because there are a lot of people who at that point, when he kind of shut down, he became hostile toward his LAPD interrogators. And those detectives could have said, we've got what we need to put him away. He's never going anywhere. And
case closed.
And that's that.
We've got it off the books.
But they realized they had somebody who had more to tell, and they were good enough to step out of the way and let somebody he'd talked to get those stories out of him. Because when you think of what that meant to those families.
And the sheer numbers. So there was a Texas Ranger essentially that flew out to California, and he went and interviewed Samuel Little and got him to confess to a bunch of stuff. And I was just reading, I forget where it was today, but this particular ranger is talking about how I don't ask the usual questions about, closure and family connections and, your conscience and things like that, because this particular type of guy doesn't really care about that and isn't necessarily dying or itching to tell you about things. So he basically came at it from some different angles and sort of the softer approach of interrogation and that kind of thing. And then he gave him art supplies. And this guy, he was also describing, the ranger's describing Samuel Little basically reaching into his memory and kind of recalling all these people. He basically had a carousel in his head of each of these people. And for our viewers, listeners at home, you can check this out on truecrimedaily.com or the YouTube channel. He produced a bunch. There's at least there's 30 here. I forget how many he did in total, but they're fairly detailed, accurate, and they're in color and all the rest. And he has described. If you go to FBI.gov and search the Samuel Little, there's some archives there. Basically, they break it down into each case. There's, what do we got here? 30 cases of unidentified murdered women still unsolved. And we're in California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, Maryland, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. This guy got around.
He did.
And they have reason to believe that these are all legitimate. So I'd urge everybody, and obviously they want to clear these books as well. We've got living relatives and that kind of thing. One of these, I forget which one it was, but was it this one? If you've got some DNA evidence, or if you are related to one of these people and you think that you are related, that they can essentially go and give a DNA sample, and some of these remains are still there.
Well, I think the big message for just overall, if you're missing someone in your family, if there's a friend you went to school with that nobody knows what happened to this person, go up to NamUs, which is a government website. Enter as much information as you can about that person. It's free. It's open to the public. NamUs will work with local jurisdictions to help them with the forensic anthropology side of missing remains and things like that. So even if this wasn't someone who was, and I'm hoping not, murdered by Samuel Little, you'll be able to take things a step farther towards solving that. And if you had a family member or know of somebody who was, in these areas and nobody heard from them, I think sometimes he targeted vulnerable populations. Obviously, he targeted sex workers, and so everybody is somebody to someone,
right?
So those women had families, those women had friends. So if that's not the issue at this point. The issue is, helping a family find out what became of somebody.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of these were in the 70s and going into the 80s. Obviously, we have technology's better nowadays, but back then you're talking about flyers or milk cartons and things like that. If somebody goes missing, if you're lucky, obviously the interconnectivity of what we have now was light years away in the 70s, and hitchhiking and people disappearing and things like that gets a little bit of a we have an idea of what the 70s were like, and this guy was busy. The 9th, like I said, we'll stick around and we're going to talk about NamUs and more forensic stuff in the web extra that we'll have next week. Just for some more details as far as the Samuel Little guy, it was strangulations, and he describes in detail. Said one woman was laughing, and other times that she was struggling for her life, and he's struggling for fun, and obviously took some sadistic pleasure out of this. I don't know a whole lot about the affect of the interviews, but he certainly seems like he's happy to. It doesn't seem like it's gleeful. It's just sort of like, since you're asking, I've got a card catalog of all this information.
Right. This is also where you begin to admire the people who do this kind of interrogation, because they have to hold it together through all of that and appear to be befriending this person, while internally they may,
to establish that rapport, you've got to make a little connection there. And, I haven't seen that show Mindhunter, but all those kind of, or profiling in general and that kind of stuff, it does take a sort of certain talent to connect like that, and then also be able to not take that home with you at the end of the day, I imagine. I'd encourage everybody to go to FBI.gov and search for Samuel Little and get more in-depth details of each of those cases. That's for fans as well as, if any of this rings a bell, or anybody in your family or anything like that, it's worth a look. This is, like I said, more information came out this week. We've been hearing about a lot of this over the past year, basically this year, but it's sort of still developing. Like they are definitely, this guy's on the map.
There's that strange window of where these guys didn't know about DNA, so they left their DNA. So they're more vulnerable in some ways than maybe the current crop is, to having left evidence behind. But on the other hand, as you say, there was no interconnection of information. Everything was paper. Many departments didn't have computers, or if they had them, they weren't connected to larger systems.
Not even a fax machine in the 70s. Yeah, no kidding. Like I say, they're vulnerable women, sex workers, drug addicts, according to the FBI. The DNA stuff, obviously we just talked about a little bit about it, but with shows like CSI and even Law & Order, for that matter, over the past 15 years, I would say, it's gotten into the collective consciousness that yes, DNA is everywhere and all these kinds of things, but even in the late 90s, it was sort of like that. The procedurals weren't as scientifically, you still had lab work and things like that, but it's
Right.
definitely much more in the public mind, if you will, especially with the true crime being a genre that people are into.
Right.
A lot of armchair experts.
We also, though, tend to believe it's all more, as I said, well-funded than it is. We tend to believe that it's, just as a good example, people think it'll solve everything. But if you have, say, one of the more common types of murder where a spouse murders a spouse, that person's DNA has every right to be there in the home.
Sure.
It's so their DNA is not going to solve the crime. If there's any other reason for the DNA of that individual to be on the scene, it's not going to be.
Right.
They have to be pretty specific kinds of places that it's found and so on. So, yeah, it's all much more complex. And the other side of that is. And, we can get into this more later, but is that throughout this country, most of the people doing the medical legal death investigation, most coroners, and first of all, there's no meaning to the words coroner or medical examiner that's accepted throughout the country. In some places, the coroner's elected. In some places, they're appointed. Sometimes they have to have a minimum education. Most places they don't. Most places you just have to not have committed a felony, to be
You get the title.
able to, over the age of 18, I think you might have to take a 10 or a 20-hour course. But my favorite example of this is when Justice Scalia died. He died in an area, Texas.
Right.
Most of it is justice of the peace. Justice of the peace isn't a lawyer. They're not a doctor. They're not even a necessarily investigator. So it's all the layers of what can go wrong are still there.
We had a guest, a former Burbank police officer, Eric Rossoff, a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about DNA tests and rape kits and the backlog of that stuff. And it's also sort of misleading that, yes, the backlogs are in many places are finally being caught up, but that just means now they have that stuff in the database, but it's still the hard work of somebody going and actually threading that needle and making those connections and things like that, which is...
Right. You still need investigators. You still need to support. It's a team effort. None of this stuff is just solved by forensics or just solved. You can solve a lot with old school investigation, but to get the conviction... and
you're not always going to have cooperative, large-scale criminals like Samuel Little confessing here. So we will update more on this developing information as it comes at truecrimedaily.com. Check that out, Samuel Little. Moving along to a story out of San Diego County in Southern California here, where we're coming from. We're coming from Southern California, not to San Diego County, but a couple hours south. There was an incident. You may recall the popular NBC show To Catch a Predator. There's been a bunch of sort of copycat activity over the past 10 or 15 years in the same way, trend across the country with individuals or groups sort of acting as online vigilantes. You remember the setup is basically they would have a specified law enforcement task force organization sort of doing online stings, going after child sex predators and things like that. You set up a date, so-called. You get the person to show up. In this case, on this particular series, it was they would have a house rigged up with cameras, and they have cops hiding in the background, and basically they have a little person a young adult who looked young, basically playing the sort of bait role. Person would come in there, they'd get them to sort of interact, and then the cops would swoop in. Everybody knows this. So in the intervening years after the show's not on anymore, but a lot of people online have sort of gone the same way, where they have taken upon themselves to sort of try to entrap people online and then get them to meet up in a certain space and then record them on their phone or camera or whatever else, confront them, get them, make a confrontation, and then ostensibly to take that information to law enforcement. And sometimes it seems like people are dedicated to that. Other times it almost seems more like an internet famous kind of a thing where they're kind of doing stunts and law enforcement agencies across the country generally, I should say specifically, don't want you to do this because you're specifically trained task force people from law enforcement agencies know how to deal with these guys. They're almost always guys in the ways that you're not entrapping and that basically they know what they're doing. If you're some sort of amateur, you could give your own location away, give all sorts of information that you're talking to a potential criminal there. Not to mention the fact that there's been more than a few confrontational incidents that have made it online, others that haven't. Nobody wants to be confronted with,
Right.
you can imagine. This Sunday in the city of Vista, California, which is about 40 miles north of San Diego, the city, sheriff's deputies responded to a report of a kidnapping outside of a coffee shop at a strip mall at about 2:30 in the afternoon. That was on Sunday. According to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, a group of juveniles, further reading tells me that this is 3 gals. This is 3 girls, 2 17-year-olds and an 18-year-old. They were apparently using a social media app to communicate in this manner, to go sort of do this online vigilante thing. They wanted to use a social media app to communicate with an older man who was allegedly seeking underage girls for sex. This group convinced this man, who was later identified as 32-year-old Robert Dreyfuss, to show up at this coffee shop where they intended to record and expose this guy, according to the department. LA Times, as I said, this is 2 17-year-olds and an 18-year-old. When Dreyfuss arrived, police say, sheriff's officials say he talked to the 17-year-old girl who was part of this group. He talked her into getting into his car so that they could talk. I don't have the details on it. It sounds like she was probably the point person on this, the one that he went to meet up with thinking she was allegedly underage. Deputies say that Dreyfuss then drove off with the girl in the car. They didn't see that coming without her consent. So he allegedly drove around with her for several miles. We don't know yet whether they sprung it and said, hey, we know who you are, you're busted, or whether she was sort of still going along with this alleged con or whatever the case was. But so he drove with her for several miles. She managed to text her friends and say, I'm in trouble. And so they called the cops, sheriff's deputies. They called Dreyfuss on his cell phone. He eventually pulled over when they were nearby. He got out and ran away on foot. They quickly apprehended him. 17-year-old girl's fine. She's rescued safely. He's been, Robert Dreyfuss has been, he was arrested for kidnapping, sending harmful matter to a minor, and communication with a minor for specific offenses. What do you think about that?
This is the ultimate do not try this at home. There are so many reasons not to do this. Let's say it worked perfectly. Courts are complicated. Individuals have rights.
Right.
And you could actually be setting yourself up for a huge lawsuit if things don't turn out the way you hoped they would. There are rules of law, there are rules of evidence, all that. But let's just go the personal safety route. I can easily think of a scenario in which he grabs her phone, tosses it out the window. Nobody can track her. Nobody can find what's become of her. Then where are we? Her friends saying, well, find friends, right. Has her off on the side of the road. And that area, Vista is very near some pretty rural areas, pretty, there's a lot of wildlife areas near there.
And that kind of area out there.
You don't have to go too far. Camp Pendleton's near there. It's wilderness.
And Camp Pendleton, exactly, a giant, sprawling military base out there where, you don't want to get lost out there either. But, yeah, there's a lot of open space out there. Some of these online vigilantes I've seen are burly men. There's there's one in particular that was an ex-military guy. And, I've seen the gamut of this. There was a guy that we covered a year or two ago who I think he was in Michigan. He's just a young kid who's probably 19 or 20, and he was going out and doing this thing, and he just was not very physically imposing. Kind of, you could kind of see the dangerous elements here. It's the first time I've seen anybody actually get sort of abducted like this, but is the natural occurrence, the natural course of events, you would think, if you're doing this. And like we say, law enforcement doesn't want you to do this. They say be a good witness if you were actually, had witnessed something like this, so that they could go through the proper route in court, that kind of thing. If you're recording on a phone, there's sort of rules about that as well. But the whole entrapment thing is it's a dangerous game. Whether these particular group were thrill-seeking or whether they were actually going after this thing or whatever, it's let the police do their job. There are better ways to be a good citizen and do this thing.
Right. There's so many ways in which law enforcement can use your support in all of this. This probably isn't your best option, would be.
Right. This could have, as you say, gone a lot worse. So at least this guy's been apprehended. Yes, exactly. We'll see I'm curious to see, and we'll find out whether anything actually does come from any alleged evidence that whatever these teens came through with. But just the abduction itself should be enough to sort of get this guy off the streets here for a while, and may or may not be an indication of guilt otherwise. So, kids, don't play this game at home. How about we go to Texas and talk about, it's the end of the season, end of the wedding season. People are kind of wrapping up. We had a couple of marriage headlines this week. This one in particular, this is a Texas man arrested last Friday night after allegedly confessing to a bank robbery in the city of Crockett, Texas, roughly halfway between Dallas and Houston. This is Heath Bumpus, is 36 years old. He's accused of robbing a bank in Groveton, Texas, about 25 miles away from where he's from, in Crockett on Friday morning. Trinity County Sheriff's officials say that Bumpus implied that he had a gun during the robbery and got away with an undisclosed amount of cash, which, if you're going to rob a bank, first of all, to me it seems ridiculous. I guess maybe in sort of remote areas of Texas or other places like that. But robbing a bank in 2019 seems like a losing prospect. It seems like technology is going to catch up with you. There's we're in Southern California here where there are all those banks. There was a bunch of bank robberies in the 90s, and I've been to banks in Orange County and things that are near the freeway where they have locking doors when you go in, so they can lock you and do all that kind of stuff. I guess out in sort of rural Texas, maybe that's not so much the case, but it still seems like a bad idea.
I don't know. Like you said, there was a period of time where the local Los Angeles FBI agency had bank robbery capital of the United States in their letterhead, and I think the guys back in D.C. saw that and said, well, let's drop that.
Then you're inviting other states to sort of hold my beer. We're gonna go after that ourselves.
Right, yeah.
So this guy Heath Bumpus, well, he was caught after his fiancée convinced him to turn himself in. She apparently saw still images of her fiancé on security footage that local authorities had released on Facebook. So Bumpus then went to Houston County Courthouse and turned himself in because his fiancée convinced him to do that, which was nice of him.
Hard for her, I'm sure, and good for her, though.
Yeah, she must have been a little surprised because, as we're going to tell you here, the alleged motivation of this alleged robbery was that he needed money to pay for the wedding ring and to pay for the wedding venue. So I'm not married, but I would think that the wedding ring, you would kind of have that in hand before you did the thing. But, he's kind of close. He had a plan here. Yeah. USA Today reports that he drove straight to the wedding venue and paid the bill for that area that day, directly after the bank. So he's a responsible guy in that regard, allegedly, before he was called by his fiancée and she got him to surrender. Bumpus has reportedly made a full confession. Wedding was scheduled to take place Saturday the next day. It didn't go off. He's charged with.
I have to admit.
He looks like a nice enough guy. I shouldn't make any judgments based on what he looks like, but he looks a little over his head. He's been charged with felony aggravated robbery. Could face up to 99 years in prison if he's convicted. Most of the money, described as less than $10,000, has been recovered. Again, robbing banks. They've got the die packs, they've got the thing, and they've got all the stuff. It's a heck of a chance. I don't know, $10,000.
Well, and as they're showing here, I mean, your neighbors have cameras for what you're taking off their porch.
Sure.
So you can be pretty sure that no matter how rural the area is, there are going to be cameras in the bank you're robbing. And social media help the police out here.
Yeah. I mean, instantaneously, and boy, it doesn't get much more intimate than your own fiancée turning you in. But I guess she could have, maybe made it work. The bad boy thing. This is how much he loves me. What's the, he's willing to do the thing.
Well, I think there are people who I think feel like, if I love someone or if they're family, I've got to do all I can on their behalf to help them escape the law. And so, like I said, to her credit, she apparently took a higher road.
Also, apparently, the sheriff's office is right down the street from this bank where this happened. So this is truly a small town and really not thought out. I mean, maybe Heath, you should have gone all the way down to the big city to do the thing if you were going to do the thing. Of course, I should say on the record, don't commit crimes and don't do bank robberies. So let's not do that. With that in mind, we do get comments. We get a lot of comments. We have a pretty good online presence on Facebook, on Twitter, on truecrimedaily.com, as well as YouTube. So we get comments. People loved this story. We've got Amanda L. said, true love knows no bounds. Rosebell O. said, married to the cell block, which, that's a good point. Cheryl P. said, was he planning on spending his marriage stealing to give his wife everything she wanted to keep her happy? That's a fair question. Like we said, I think you addressed that a little bit. This woman decided to go the high road instead of kind of looking the other way. Like I said, some people love the bad boy or the bad girl, and apparently that was a bridge too far for her.
Well, I think also ideally she's figured out that Heath is not someone who thinks very far ahead.
Yeah, that's true. It's a bullet dodge there, isn't it?
It seems to me, and maybe this is an aberrant moment for him, but...
right. Well, that's true. We don't know whether this is a whirlwind thing, and he decided, if they'd gotten engaged this week, and I forgot about that ring. I've got to do the thing, or whether I'm a procrastinator, I'm a deadline kind of guy. So all the way at the last minute, I'm getting married the day after tomorrow. Boy, I better come up with a plan. Anyway, I hate to make light of the fact that this guy's in jail and he's doing the bank robbery. Don't do bank robberies, and go make your wife an honest woman without. Stealing the funds, allegedly, to get that. To our next story we get comments about this particular woman who employees called police about a woman burning off price tags with a butane torch and then placing the merchandise in a bag. This was at a Walmart. After officers handcuffed her, police say she attempted to kick and headbutt officers. She did not go quietly. Kimberly H. says, damn, if Walmart price tags were too much for her, she goes to Macy's, she would burn down the whole store. I guess that's not the worst way to go. I mean, you're sort of destroying. If there's no price tag, then who's to say I didn't wear this in or you didn't bring this in or whatever? But
it's kind of hard to do that on the slide.
Inconspicuously, yeah. One thing was just to snip with little scissors, but burning them off. Sean de M says, if I'm going to jail over clothes, it won't be from Walmart. That's a good point. You might want to go somewhere else, but again, don't commit crimes. Don't do this. Samantha J says, you can literally pull the tag off with no one noticing. There is that. This woman had a plan. She was committed to it. We will keep you updated with how that turns out when we have more information on her. That is about it for our show this week. Thank you, Jan Burke, for being here with us this week. Really appreciate it. Where do you like to send for viewers and listeners and people who are interested in what you're doing? Where do you get most of your content?
I have a website that's just my name, JanBurke.com, and you can find me there. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, all the usual spots.
Gotcha. Got to be there.
And I'm also would love it if people would visit, as I said, NamUs. It's like name us without the E.
Right.
And .gov and check out that site. see what they can do
which
for
we're
you.
going to talk a little bit about now in a couple minutes here. We'll have this web extra here for you next week. And of course, we'll put all your contact details in the descriptions of the podcast and our YouTube video. You can find our content on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, and on YouTube. Get our updates and subscribe to our newsletter at truecrimedaily.com. Until next week, this is True Crime Daily, the podcast reminding you, don't do crimes.